The old navy blue dress hung on the back of the closet door like a faithful friend. Margaret Chen had worn it to her daughter's graduation 3 years ago, and before that to her nephew's wedding. Tonight it would accompany her to a place she never imagined she'd set foot in. She stood in front of her small bedroom mirror, adjusting the simple silver necklace her late mother had given her. The chain was thin, and the small cross pendant caught the light from the single lamp beside her bed. Margaret's reflection showed a woman in her early 50s, with kind eyes and hands that told stories of hard work. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she'd applied a light touch of lipstick, the same shade she'd been using for years. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks ago, delivered to the office building where she worked as head of the cleaning crew. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, with gold lettering that seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights of the janitor's closet where she'd opened it. The annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala, it read, and Margaret had to read it twice before believing it was addressed to her. Her supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, had explained it later. The company wanted to show they cared about all their employees, not just the ones in suits who worked on the upper floors. They'd chosen Margaret to represent the support staff because she'd been with them the longest. 15 years of arriving before dawn and leaving after sunset, making sure every office sparkled. Margaret had wanted to decline. What would she have in common with doctors, lawyers, and business owners? What would she say if someone asked her about her work? But Mrs. Patterson had insisted it would be good for the company's image, and Margaret didn't like disappointing people. Now, as she gathered her small purse and checked her appearance one last time, Margaret felt her stomach flutter with nervousness. She'd taken 3 buses to get to the fancy hotel downtown, watching through the window as the neighborhoods changed from her modest apartment complex to towering glass buildings that seemed to touch the sky. The hotel lobby took her breath away. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks, and the marble floors were so polished she could see her reflection. Men in expensive suits and women in elegant gowns moved through the space with the confidence of people who belonged there. Margaret felt like she was watching a movie, except she was somehow part of the scene. A young woman in a black uniform directed her toward the ballroom, and Margaret's shoes clicked softly on the marble as she made her way through the crowd. The sound seemed too loud to her own ears, though no one else appeared to notice. She passed by conversations about vacation homes in places she'd only seen in magazines and business deals worth more money than she'd make in a lifetime. The ballroom itself was magnificent. Round tables covered in white cloth filled the space, each decorated with towering arrangements of white roses and baby's breath. At the front of the room stood a grand piano, its black surface so shiny it reflected the light from the massive chandelier above. Margaret's steps slowed as she looked at it, something stirring in her chest that she hadn't felt in decades. Her assigned table was near the back, just as she'd expected. A small card with her name written in elegant script marked her seat. She pulled out the chair carefully and sat down, smoothing her dress beneath her. The other seats at the table remained empty as guests mingled during the cocktail hour. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and watched the room fill with laughter and conversation. She recognized some faces from television, a news anchor she watched every morning, a local politician whose campaign signs had dotted her neighborhood, a businessman whose company sponsored the city's baseball team. They all moved with an ease that came from attending events like this regularly. A server approached her table carrying a tray of crystal glasses filled with something golden and bubbly. Margaret had never tasted champagne before, but she accepted a glass with a quiet thank you. The bubbles tickled her nose, and she took only a small sip before setting it down. She thought about her daughter, Lisa, who was working the night shift at the hospital across town. Lisa would be proud to know her mother was here, supporting the same children's hospital where she worked as a nurse. Margaret had raised Lisa alone after her husband died in a construction accident when Lisa was only 12. There had been no money for extras then, no fancy clothes or expensive outings. But they'd made it work, the two of them against the world. The invitation had said the event would raise money for new medical equipment and programs for young patients. Margaret thought about the children Lisa told her about, brave little ones fighting battles no child should have to fight. That's what made her nerves settle a bit. She was here for them, even if she felt out of place. As the evening progressed and guests began finding their seats, Margaret's table slowly filled. A couple in their 60s sat to her left, discussing their recent cruise to Europe. To her right, a woman perhaps 10 years younger than Margaret talked animatedly about her son's acceptance to an expensive private college. They were all polite enough, offering brief smiles and nods when they noticed her, but the conversations flowed around her like water around a stone. Margaret didn't mind being overlooked. She was used to being invisible in her work, cleaning offices while their occupants were home with their families. She'd perfected the art of moving quietly through spaces, completing her tasks without disturbing anyone's day. In many ways, this felt familiar, but the piano kept drawing her attention. During her childhood in her family's small apartment, an old upright piano had stood against the wall of their living room. Her mother had saved for 2 years to buy it, working double shifts at the textile factory. "Music is food for the soul," her mother used to say in her accented English, encouraging Margaret to practice even when their neighbors complained about the noise. Those had been different times. Margaret had shown such promise that her high school music teacher had talked about scholarships and conservatories. The piano had been her escape, her joy, her dream of a different future. But dreams, she'd learned, sometimes had to make room for reality. She pushed those memories away and focused on the present. The auction was about to begin, and she watched as beautiful items were displayed and bid upon. Art pieces, vacation packages, and jewelry all found new homes with generous donors. Margaret couldn't afford to bid on anything, but she clapped politely for each successful sale, knowing every dollar would help children who needed it. The evening was turning out better than she'd feared. She was invisible but comfortable, present but not pressured to perform or pretend to be someone she wasn't. Soon, they would serve dinner, followed by speeches from hospital administrators and perhaps a few grateful families. Then she could slip out quietly and catch the late bus home. What Margaret couldn't see was the group of men gathering near the bar, their voices carrying the particular tone of people who'd had too much to drink and too little consideration for others. What she couldn't predict was how quickly a pleasant evening could turn into something that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed what was about to unfold. The dinner service had just begun when Margaret noticed the group of men at the bar getting louder. Their laughter carried across the ballroom, sharp and attention-seeking in a way that made other guests glance over with raised eyebrows. She tried not to stare, but something about their behavior made her uncomfortable. The man at the center of their group was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and even from her distant table, she could see the gold watch glinting on his wrist. He gestured wildly as he spoke, causing the ice in his crystal glass to clink against the sides. "Richard Hamilton," whispered the woman sitting next to Margaret, noticing her gaze. "He owns half the commercial real estate downtown. His wife usually keeps him in line, but she's not here tonight." Margaret nodded politely and turned back to her salad. She'd heard the name before. Hamilton Properties had a sign on the building where she worked. So this was her ultimate boss, though she doubted he knew she existed. The auction had ended successfully, raising more money than the organizers had hoped. Now, as guests enjoyed their meals, the atmosphere had relaxed considerably. Wine flowed freely and conversations grew more animated. Margaret picked at her chicken, which was delicious but somehow felt too fancy for her simple tastes. "Ladies and gentlemen," the event coordinator announced from the small stage near the piano, "we'll have a brief intermission before our keynote speaker. Please feel free to mingle and enjoy the evening." Most guests remained seated, but some wandered toward the silent auction tables that lined one wall. Others stepped outside onto the hotel's balcony for fresh air. The men at the bar, however, seemed to be plotting something. Margaret watched as Richard Hamilton's eyes scanned the room like a predator looking for prey. His gaze stopped on various tables, dismissing some guests and lingering on others. When his eyes reached Margaret's table, they paused. She quickly looked down at her plate, hoping to avoid any attention, but she could feel his stare continuing. "Gentlemen," Hamilton's voice boomed louder now, causing several nearby tables to turn. "We have a wonderful piano here, and it's been sitting silent all evening. Don't you think our guests deserve some entertainment?" His companions laughed and agreed, though Margaret noticed some of their wives exchanging uncomfortable glances. One woman, elegantly dressed in emerald green, placed her hand on Hamilton's arm and whispered something that looked like a warning. He brushed her off with a dismissive wave. "The question is," Hamilton continued, his words slightly slurred from the evening's drinks, "who should we ask to play? Perhaps someone who might surprise us all?" Margaret's stomach began to knot. Something in his tone made her want to disappear entirely. She glanced around the table, but her dinner companions were absorbed in their own conversations. Only she seemed to notice the predatory gleam in Hamilton's eyes. The businessman began walking through the ballroom, his group trailing behind him like loyal followers. He stopped at various tables, making small talk with people he clearly knew well. But Margaret realized with growing dread that he was making his way systematically toward the back of the room, toward her table. "Excuse me," said the woman in emerald green, appearing suddenly at Margaret's elbow. "You're Margaret Chen, aren't you?" From the cleaning staff at the Meridian building, Margaret nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Patricia Hamilton, Richard's wife." The woman's smile was tight with what looked like embarrassment. "I want to apologize in advance for whatever my husband is about to do. He gets these ideas when he's been drinking, and he thinks they're much funnier than they actually are." Before Margaret could respond, Richard Hamilton himself appeared at their table, flanked by 3 other men who looked like they were barely containing their amusement. Well, Hamilton said, his voice carrying clearly across the nearby tables. "Margaret Chen, isn't it? You're the woman who keeps our building so spotless. We really appreciate your hard work." Margaret stood up carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Please sit," he gestured grandly. "I have a wonderful idea. You know, we have this beautiful piano up there, and it seems such a shame to let it sit unused. I was thinking, wouldn't it be delightful if you played something for our guests?" The request hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt every eye at nearby tables turning toward them. The conversations around her seemed to fade as people began to notice the scene unfolding. "Oh, I don't really play," Margaret said quietly, though the words felt like lies on her tongue. "Nonsense." Hamilton's voice grew louder, ensuring that even more guests could hear. "I bet you're just being modest. Come on, just one song. How hard can it be? I'm sure our guests would love to hear something authentic." The way he said the word authentic made Margaret's cheeks burn with shame. She understood exactly what this was. Entertainment at her expense. A joke for the wealthy guests to laugh about later. One of Hamilton's companions, a man with thinning hair and a cruel smile, chimed in. Yes, it would be so. Refreshing to hear something different from the usual classical stuff they play at these events. Margaret looked around desperately. Some guests were watching with obvious discomfort, recognizing the cruelty of the situation. Others seemed curious, perhaps even excited by the prospect of witnessing someone's humiliation. A few looked away entirely, not wanting to be part of whatever was happening. "Richard, that's enough," Patricia Hamilton hissed. But her husband ignored her. "Come now, Margaret," Hamilton continued, his false cheerfulness becoming more obvious with each word. "Don't be shy, I insist. Consider it a command performance from your employer." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret worked for his company. Her job, her ability to pay rent and support herself, depended on keeping people like Richard Hamilton happy. She thought about Lisa, about the bills that came every month, about the fact that jobs weren't easy to find at her age. "I really don't think that's a good idea," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, but I do," Hamilton replied, his smile never wavering. "In fact, I think it's a wonderful idea. And you know what? If you play something nice for us, I'll make sure there's a little bonus in your next paycheck. What do you say to that?" His companions laughed as if he'd made the funniest joke in the world. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. She wanted to run, to disappear, to be anywhere but in this beautiful ballroom being treated like a performing animal. But then she thought about the children this event was meant to help. She thought about her daughter working the night shift at the hospital, caring for those same children. She thought about her mother's words from so long ago. Music is food for the soul, and something deep inside her, something that had been sleeping for 30 years, began to stir. "All right," Margaret said quietly. So quietly that Hamilton had to lean forward to hear her. "I'll play something." The businessman clapped his hands together in delight. "Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen," he called out to the entire ballroom, "we have a special treat. Margaret here has agreed to provide us with some entertainment." A smattering of polite applause filled the room. though Margaret could hear the uncertainty in it. People weren't sure if they should be excited or embarrassed for what they were about to witness. As Margaret stood and smoothed down her navy blue dress, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. Her legs felt unsteady as she began the long walk toward the front of the ballroom, toward the gleaming black piano that sat waiting like an old friend she hadn't seen in decades. Behind her, she could hear Hamilton's group settling in to enjoy the show they thought they were about to witness. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly know, was that they were about to discover just how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone based on their circumstances. The piano bench seemed miles away, but Margaret kept walking, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else she hadn't felt in years, something that felt almost like anticipation. The walk to the piano felt like walking through water. Each step seemed to take forever, and Margaret was aware of every sound in the ballroom, the clink of glasses, the whispered conversations, the scrape of chairs as people turned to get a better view of what they expected to be a spectacle. Her hands were shaking now, not just from nerves but from something deeper. As she got closer to the piano, memories came flooding back like a dam had burst in her mind. She could almost hear her mother's voice. "Sit up straight, Margaret. Let the music flow through your fingers like water through a stream." The piano bench was exactly the right height. Margaret had forgotten how that felt, the way a good bench would support her just right, allowing her arms to fall naturally to the keys. She sat down carefully, her navy blue dress spreading around her, and for a moment she just stared at the keys. They were perfect, clean and white and black, arranged in the pattern that had been her language once upon a time. 88 keys that could create infinite possibilities. Her fingers hovered over them, trembling. Behind her, she could hear Richard Hamilton settling into a front row seat with his friends. Someone whispered something that made them chuckle quietly. She heard a woman, probably his wife, saying something sharp under her breath. But these sounds felt far away now, like they were coming from another world. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Suddenly, she was 8 years old again, sitting at the old upright piano in their tiny apartment. Her mother was beside her, guiding her small hands to the correct positions. "Music is not about the notes on the page, little one," her mother had said. "Music is about the feeling in your heart." Her fingers found middle C without her even looking. The muscle memory was still there after all these years. 30 years since she'd played seriously. 30 years since she'd given up her dreams to take care of her sick parents. 30 years since she'd closed the piano bench for what she thought was the last time. The ballroom had gone quiet. Margaret could feel the weight of all those eyes on her, waiting. Some were waiting for her to fail, to give them a story they could tell at their next dinner party. Others, the kinder ones, were simply curious. A few might even be hoping she would do well. She thought about Lisa, working her shift at the children's hospital. Her daughter had never heard her mother play, had never known about the scholarship offers and the dreams that had once seemed so possible. Margaret had packed all of that away when she became a mother, when survival became more important than dreams. But tonight, in this moment, sitting at this beautiful piano in front of all these people who thought they knew exactly who she was, Margaret felt something awakening in her chest. It was like a bird that had been sleeping for decades, suddenly stretching its wings. Her fingers pressed down on the keys, and the first note rang out clear and true. It was the opening of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece she had performed at her high school recital so many years ago. The note hung in the air, pure and resonant, and Margaret felt her whole body relax into the familiar rhythm of making music. The second note followed, then the third, and suddenly her hands were moving with a grace and confidence that surprised even her. The melody flowed from her fingers like it had been waiting all these years to be released. Each note was placed with precision, with feeling, with the kind of technical skill that takes years to develop and a lifetime to master. Behind her, the laughter died away. The whispered comments stopped. Even the servers moving between tables seemed to slow their steps, drawn by the unexpected beauty filling the room. Margaret's eyes remained closed, but she could feel the change in the atmosphere. The piece she had chosen was one of Chopin's most beloved nocturnes, a melody that seemed to capture all the longing and beauty and sadness of the human heart. Her hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence, remembering not just the notes but the emotion behind them. The left hand played the gentle, rolling accompaniment while her right hand sang the melody with a warmth and expression that comes only from years of training and natural talent. She wasn't just playing the notes, she was telling a story, painting pictures with sound, sharing pieces of her soul with every phrase. In the audience, people began to lean forward in their seats. Conversations that had been continuing in whispers stopped entirely. Even the waiters in the back of the room paused in their work, drawn by the unexpected beauty of what they were hearing. Margaret's technique was flawless, but more than that, her interpretation was deeply moving. She played with the kind of musical maturity that only comes from having lived, from having experienced loss and joy and struggle. Every note seemed to carry the weight of her life, the sacrifices she'd made, the dreams she'd set aside, the love she'd poured into raising her daughter alone. The middle section of the nocturne is more complex, with rapid passages that require both technical skill and deep musical understanding. Margaret's fingers danced over the keys with a speed and accuracy that made it clear this was no amateur dabbling. This was the playing of someone who had once been destined for concert halls, someone who had trained seriously and extensively. Richard Hamilton's face had gone pale. The smug smile had disappeared completely, replaced by a look of shock and something that might have been shame. His companions sat in stunned silence, realizing that their cruel joke had backfired spectacularly. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Margaret opened her eyes for the first time since she'd begun playing. She looked out at the audience and saw faces she didn't expect, faces filled with wonder, with respect, with genuine emotion. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others sat with their mouths slightly open, unable to believe what they were hearing. The final phrase of the nocturne requires particular delicacy, a gentle fade that leaves the listener hanging in the beauty of the moment. Margaret's right hand played the last few notes with such tenderness, such perfect control, that they seemed to float in the air before slowly disappearing into silence. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the ballroom remained absolutely quiet for what felt like an eternity. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding, unsure of what would happen next. Then, somewhere in the middle of the room, someone began to clap. It started as a single pair of hands, slow and deliberate, but within seconds the entire ballroom erupted in applause. People rose from their seats, first a few, then entire tables, until the whole room was on its feet, clapping and cheering with genuine enthusiasm and respect. Margaret stood slowly, her legs still shaky from the adrenaline and emotion of the performance. She gave a small, modest bow, the same way her music teacher had taught her all those years ago. The applause continued, washing over her like a warm tide. As she looked out at the sea of faces, no longer looking at her with curiosity or condescension, but with admiration and respect, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in decades. She felt seen, not as a cleaning woman or a single mother or someone to be pitied or mocked, but as the artist she had always been. Deep inside, the dreams she thought she had buried forever were still there, still alive, still part of who she was. And for the first time in 30 years, Margaret Chen remembered what it felt like to soar. The applause seemed to go on forever, but eventually it began to fade. Margaret remained standing beside the piano, her heart still racing from the performance and the overwhelming response. She had forgotten what it felt like to share music with an audience, to feel that electric connection between performer and listener. As people slowly began to sit back down, she noticed that many were still staring at her with expressions of amazement. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. Others were shaking their heads as if they couldn't quite believe what they had just witnessed. Margaret started to make her way back to her table, hoping to quietly return to her seat and let the evening continue. But before she could take more than a few steps, people began approaching her. The first was an elderly woman in a pearl necklace who looked like she might be someone important. "My dear," the woman said, taking Margaret's hand gently. "That was absolutely extraordinary. I haven't heard Chopin played with such feeling in years. Where did you study?" Margaret felt her cheeks flush. Well, it was a long time ago. Just locally, nothing special." But the woman wasn't satisfied with that answer. "Nothing special? Young lady, what I just heard was the playing of someone with serious classical training. That kind of technique and interpretation doesn't come from nothing special." More people had gathered around them now, creating a small circle near the piano. Margaret felt overwhelmed by all the attention. She wasn't used to being the center of anything, let alone a room full of wealthy strangers wanting to know her story. "Please," said a man in an expensive suit. "We'd love to hear about your musical background." That performance was, well, it was professional quality. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her. These were the same people who, just minutes ago, had been prepared to watch her fail for their entertainment. Now they were looking at her with genuine respect and curiosity. "I started playing when I was very young," she began quietly. "My mother saved up to buy an old piano for our apartment. She worked extra shifts at the factory so I could have lessons." As she spoke, more people joined the group. Even some of the hotel staff had stopped their work to listen, standing at the edges of the crowd with obvious interest. "My teacher said I had talent," Margaret continued, her voice growing slightly stronger as she shared memories she had kept buried for so long. "When I was 17, I auditioned for several music schools. I was accepted to the conservatory with a partial scholarship." A murmur went through the crowd. These people understood what that meant. Getting into conservatory required exceptional talent and years of dedicated training. "So you studied music professionally?" asked the woman with the pearls. Margaret shook her head, and for a moment the joy in her eyes dimmed. "No, I never went. My parents both got sick that year. My father had been exposed to chemicals at his construction job, and my mother's health was failing from all those years in the factory. I was their only child, and they needed someone to take care of them." The crowd had gone very quiet. Even the background noise of the hotel seemed to fade as people strained to hear her words. "I took a job cleaning office buildings instead. Night shift, so I could be home with them during the day. I told myself I would go back to music later, after they got better." She paused, looking down at her hands, the same hands that had just created such beauty at the piano. "They never got better. And by the time, well, life just took me in a different direction." "You never played again?" someone asked softly. "Not seriously. We had to sell the piano to pay for medical bills. I would sometimes play at church when their regular pianist was sick, but nothing like tonight. Tonight was the first time in 30 years that I played a real piece on a real piano." The silence that followed was different from the silence after her performance. This was the silence of people realizing how wrong their assumptions had been, how cruel their entertainment had almost become. Richard Hamilton had been standing at the back of the group, and now he stepped forward. His face was red, whether from embarrassment or the evening's drinks, Margaret couldn't tell. His earlier confidence was completely gone. "Margaret," he said, his voice much quieter than it had been before, "I owe you an apology, a serious apology. What I did tonight was—" He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "There's no excuse for it. I made assumptions about you based on your job, and I was completely wrong." Margaret looked at him with steady eyes. "Mr. Hamilton, you're not the first person to look at what I do for work and think that's all I am. But thank you for saying that." "No," Hamilton continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "It's not enough to just apologize. What I did was cruel, and it could have humiliated you in front of all these people. Instead, you showed us something beautiful, something incredible. You have a gift that most of us will never possess." His wife, Patricia, had appeared beside him. "Margaret, I'm so sorry for my husband's behavior, but I'm also grateful that somehow his foolishness led to us hearing you play. That was one of the most moving performances I've ever witnessed." Other people began sharing their thoughts. A doctor mentioned that his daughter was studying piano and would never sound as accomplished as Margaret had tonight. A lawyer said he had season tickets to the symphony, and Margaret's playing was better than some of the soloists he'd heard there. "What I don't understand," said the elderly woman with the pearls, "is how someone with your talent ended up—" She paused, realizing how her words might sound. "Cleaning buildings?" Margaret finished gently. "Because someone had to pay the bills. Because my parents needed medicine and care, and later my daughter needed food and clothes and a roof over her head. Music is beautiful, but it doesn't always put dinner on the table." A younger woman stepped forward from the crowd. "I'm Jennifer Walsh," she said. "I work for the Arts Council downtown. We run programs to bring music education to underserved communities. Would you be interested in talking with us? We're always looking for qualified teachers." Another person, a man who had introduced himself as a music professor at the local university, asked if she would consider giving a master class for his students. "They need to hear someone who understands the technique means nothing without soul," he said. Margaret felt overwhelmed by all the offers and suggestions. For 30 years she had been invisible in her work, someone people looked through rather than at. Now suddenly everyone wanted to talk to her, to offer her opportunities to hear her story. "I appreciate all of this," she said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "But I need to think. Tonight has been, well, it's been more than I ever expected." The crowd began to disperse slowly, but not before many people pressed business cards into Margaret's hands or wrote their phone numbers on napkins. The evening's program had been completely forgotten. The keynote speaker would have to wait for another time. As Margaret finally made her way back to her table, she noticed that people were looking at her differently now, not with pity or condescension, but with respect. Some nodded as she passed, and she heard whispered conversations about her performance following in her wake. She sat down in her chair and looked at the small pile of business cards and phone numbers in front of her. Her navy blue dress was the same. Her simple silver necklace hadn't changed. Her weathered hands looked exactly as they had when she'd arrived. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in decades, people saw her not as just a cleaning woman, but as Margaret Chen, the woman who had sacrificed her dreams for her family, who had carried music in her heart through 30 years of hard work and responsibility, who had just proven that talent and dignity can exist in the most unexpected places. The evening wasn't over yet, but Margaret already knew that her life would never be quite the same again. The question now was what she would do with this unexpected second chance, this gift that had come disguised as a cruel joke. She looked up at the piano, still gleaming under the ballroom lights, and for the first time in 30 years, she allowed herself to imagine possibilities she had thought were lost forever. Margaret didn't sleep much that night. She sat in her small apartment, still wearing the navy blue dress, staring at the pile of business cards and phone numbers spread across her kitchen table. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the piano keys beneath her fingers and feel the electricity of that standing ovation. Her phone had been buzzing all evening. Lisa, her daughter, had called 3 times from the hospital, but Margaret hadn't been ready to explain what had happened. How do you tell someone that your entire life changed in the space of one piano piece? What Margaret didn't know was that someone in the audience had been recording. Jennifer Walsh from the Arts Council had been filming short clips throughout the evening for the organization's social media, and she had captured Margaret's entire performance on her phone. The next morning, Jennifer posted the video on the Arts Council's page with a simple caption: "Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. Meet Margaret Chen, a woman who reminded us all never to judge a book by its cover." The video started spreading slowly at first. Friends of people who had been at the gala shared it with their own networks. Music teachers sent it to their students. Piano enthusiasts posted it in online forums dedicated to classical music. But then something remarkable happened. The story behind the performance, the cruel setup, Margaret's grace under pressure, and the revelation of her sacrificed dreams began to spread along with the video. People weren't just sharing a beautiful piano performance. They were sharing a story about dignity, hidden talents, and second chances. By the end of the first week, the video had been viewed over 1 million times. Comments poured in from around the world. Professional musicians praised Margaret's technique and emotional depth. Teachers shared it with students as an example of what music should sound like. But most of the comments came from ordinary people who saw themselves in Margaret's story. "This made me cry," wrote one viewer. "My grandmother was a talented artist but had to give up her dreams to raise her children. This is for all the people whose talents we never got to see." Another comment read, "I work as a janitor at a school and people look right through me every day. Thank you for reminding the world that we all have stories worth hearing." Margaret's phone started ringing constantly. News stations wanted interviews. Music schools reached out with teaching opportunities. Concert halls invited her to perform. A talent agent left 5 voicemails in one day. The attention was overwhelming, but it was Richard Hamilton's call that surprised her most. "Margaret," he said when she finally answered, "I've been thinking about what happened that night, and I want to do something meaningful to make up for my behavior. Would you be willing to meet with me?" They met at a small coffee shop near Margaret's apartment. Hamilton looked different in casual clothes, older, more human somehow. His wife Patricia was with him and she greeted Margaret with a warm hug. "I can't undo what I did," Hamilton said after they sat down, "but I want to create something positive from it. Patricia and I have been talking, and we want to start a scholarship fund. Music education for talented students whose families can't afford it. Patricia leaned forward. We've already spoken with the conservatory. They remember your audition from 30 years ago, Margaret. They said you were one of the most promising applicants they'd seen that year. We want to call it the Margaret Chen Foundation, Hamilton continued, and we want you to help us run it. Not just your name on it. We want your input, your story, your experience to guide how we help these kids. Margaret sat quietly for a moment, processing the offer. Why? She finally asked. Hamilton's answer was simple and honest. Because I've spent my whole life thinking I knew people based on what they looked like or what job they had. You showed me how wrong I could be and how much I could miss. Maybe if we help other people avoid making the same mistake I did, some good can come from that night. The foundation became reality within 6 months. Margaret found herself in a position she never could have imagined, working with music teachers, counselors, and administrators to identify talented young people who needed financial help to pursue their dreams. She learned about grant applications, scholarship requirements, and fundraising events. But more importantly, she started playing piano again. Jennifer Walsh from the Arts Council had been persistent in her offers, and eventually Margaret agreed to teach a few classes at the community center. Her first student was a shy 12-year-old girl whose parents cleaned offices downtown, just like Margaret had. Music is not about the notes on the page, Margaret told the girl, echoing her mother's words from so long ago. Music is about the feeling in your heart. The girl nodded seriously, her small fingers finding the keys with determination that reminded Margaret of herself at that age. Word of mouth brought more students. Soon Margaret was teaching 3 afternoons a week and the waiting list kept growing. She had to laugh sometimes at the irony. She was making more money teaching piano part-time than she had made cleaning buildings full-time. But the most meaningful moment came 6 months after the gala, when Margaret walked into the children's hospital where Lisa worked. The hospital had asked her to play for some of the long-term patients, and she had agreed. As she sat up at the old upright piano in the children's recreation room, a little boy in a wheelchair rolled up beside her. "Are you the lady from the video?" he asked with the directness that only children possess. Margaret smiled. "I suppose I am. My mom showed it to me," he continued. "She said you prove that everyone has something special inside them, even when other people can't see it," as Margaret began to play, this time choosing a gentle piece that wouldn't be too sad for the children. She realized that this little boy understood something that had taken her 50 years to fully grasp. Everyone does have something special inside them. The tragedy isn't when others can't see it. The tragedy is when we stop believing in it ourselves. The video continued to circulate, touching lives in ways Margaret never expected. Teachers used it in lessons about empathy and assumptions. Businesses shared it in training about treating all employees with respect. Musicians posted response videos, sharing their own stories of unexpected talent found in unlikely places. But perhaps the most important change was in Margaret herself. She had spent 30 years making herself invisible, apologizing for taking up space, accepting that her dreams belonged to the past. Now, for the first time since she was 17 years old, she was planning for a future that included music. The navy blue dress still hung in her closet, but Margaret had bought herself a new outfit, a deep red dress that made her feel confident and beautiful. She wore it to the foundation's first scholarship awards ceremony, where 5 young musicians received full funding to pursue their musical education. As she watched their faces light up when their names were called, Margaret thought about the strange path that had brought her to this moment. A cruel joke had become a gift. A moment of humiliation had transformed into triumph. The dream she thought she had buried had simply been waiting for the right moment to bloom again. Standing at the podium that night, looking out at an audience that saw her not as a cleaning woman but as a musician, teacher, and advocate for young artists, Margaret spoke from her heart. "Music lives in all of us," she said. "Sometimes it gets buried under bills and responsibilities and other people's expectations. But it never really dies. Tonight is proof that it's never too late for a second chance, and it's never wrong to believe in the power of a dream." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, just like that night at the gala. But this time Margaret wasn't surprised by it. She had finally learned to see herself the way music had always seen her, as someone worthy of being heard.